Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is our first event of the spring season at Labyrinth Books, and I'm really excited about tonight's conversation and also about the lineup for the coming weeks and months. You can check all those out under the events tab on our website at labyrinthbooks.com. But I just want to begin quickly by thanking our co-sponsors for this discussion of Adam Jentleson's new book, Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. Here it is, so you can see it if you don't already own it. Those co-sponsors are the Election Innovation Lab at Princeton School for Public and International Affairs, and the Princeton Public Library, and they are all cherished partners of Labyrinth. So just a quick few practical matters. If you'd like to buy a copy of Kill Switch, and I think you ought to, you'll see a link to our website in green at the bottom of the screen, and you can just enter the code Jentleson at checkout, and that will give you 10% off on your entire order. Or else you can give us a call or send us an email, and I've put the information for that at the top of the chat. So you can scroll back up and get that from there if you need to. We are looking forward to your questions following the conversation among our guests. And I want to point out that to ask a question, you're going to need to click the Ask a Question button also at the bottom of the screen rather than using the chat. And please just enter those as they come to you. It helps us because seeing how many questions are in the queue then lets us know sort of how much time to leave for the Q&A. So just feel free to line those up. Feel encouraged to do that. So in the weeks since the inauguration, tonight's discussion of Adam Jentleson's book has gone from seeming interesting to feeling urgently important. In that time, the filibuster has gone from being a procedural topic that people may not have thought or talked much about to being suddenly recognized as a central question, central to the question of how to break through a pattern of de facto minority, conservative, white rule in the US. And I can think of no better guide to unpacking the politics of the Senate and the history and role of the filibuster in particular than Adam Jentleson, and of no better discussants than our two other guests, Sam Wang and Julian Zelizer. So just a few biographical notes about each, and then Sam and Julian will take it from there. Adam Jentleson served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid, where he advised on strategy and also led one of the largest and most diverse communications teams on Capitol Hill during the Obama administration. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Political Magazine. That's not a full list, lots of other places. You probably also know him as a regular commentator on MSNBC. And Sam Wang is professor of neuroscience at Princeton. He's the author of two sort of perennially best-selling books at Labyrinth. They are Welcome to Your Brain and Welcome to Your Child's Brain. But today, as on many occasions, Sam is wearing his hat as co-founder and director of the Electoral Innovation Lab, which combines the former Princeton Election Consortium and Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Julian Zelizer is Sam's co-conspirator at the Electoral Innovation Lab, as well as professor of history at Princeton University. And he is the author of far too many books and editor, I think 19 at my last count to list. But I will just mention here his most recent one, and that is Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party, which came out just last year. So here they are now. I'm going to duck out myself and bring them up on screen. Hang on, with a few clicks of the button. Here comes Julian.
Hello.
And here comes Sam.
Hey there.
And here comes our author, Adam. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Take it away.
So this is great.
It's terrific to be here with you, Adam. We're delighted to have you. I heard about Adam a while back, and I think I learned about you through Twitter, and you were tweeting all these interesting things about the Senate. And then I discovered you had worked for Senator Reid. And then I started reading your writing about the filibuster, and I knew you were a kindred spirit. So maybe we can just start with you and the book. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you decided to dive into this and to produce a history of the Senate and a history of the filibuster?
Yes, I can. I just first wanted to say thank you, Julian and Sam. I'm a student of your work as well. And thank you to Labyrinth Books for hosting this. I was an undergraduate at Columbia, and one of their stores on the Upper West Side, I spent far too much time and my parents' money there. So it's great to be here with all of you tonight. The reason I wrote this book was it sort of started as an effort to answer all of the questions that I had after my time working in the Senate. And I certainly had way more questions than answers. And I felt like I had many more questions than when I'd started there. The Senate, I came to it having worked in politics for a while already. I wasn't exactly sort of a starry-eyed idealist. I didn't expect a whole lot from the institution in many ways, but it sort of it fell below even my lowest expectations and fears, and in ways that I think were pretty devastating for the country at the time, and I think raised questions I thought deserved to be answered. I think principally, what the question I wanted an answer to was, you're told as you learn about the Senate, and including while you're working there, that yes, the institution may be frustrating. Yes, it may move very slowly, but this is all part of the wisdom of the institution, and that this is the way it was supposed to be, and that in fact, this slow-moving pace serves a productive purpose, and it serves a good purpose in shaping legislation to last and shaping legislation to be bipartisan. And when I was there, I simply couldn't match that description and reputation to the Senate that I found in reality. And, I opened the book with a description of the failure of the Manchin-Toomey background checks amendment in 2013. And in many ways, that to me encapsulates this failure. Here you had a very reasonable policy. Many would argue that it didn't go nearly far enough in responding to the murder of 20 first graders in Newtown, Connecticut. This was April 2013 after that massacre occurred in December of 2012, the previous year. Expanding universal background checks was supported at the time by 90% of the American public. The bill itself had everything that you're sort of taught a bill is supposed to have in order to pass. It assembled a bipartisan majority of Democrats and Republicans. It was co-sponsored by two sort of strange bedfellow senators who couldn't have been more different, sort of rough-edge populist Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Country Club Chamber of Commerce Republican Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. But it didn't pass, and it was killed by a modern version of the filibuster. But unlike the filibuster that we've come to intuit and sort of the filibuster of popular imagination and Jimmy Stewart standing on the floor of the Senate and Mr. Smith goes to Washington, unlike that image of the filibuster, there was no debate. For the week that the bill was on the floor, its opponents barely bothered to come to the floor and argue against it. Senator Mitch McConnell, who was leading the minority at the time, found about 2 minutes in total, literally, over the course of that week to bother debating the bill. He found more time to discuss the NCAA championship victory of the Louisville men's basketball team, of which he is a big fan. And so everything about this process was alien to this idea of the Senate. The bill assembled a bipartisan majority, but it failed. It failed on a filibuster, but there was no debate. And so I felt a burning desire to find the answer to these questions and try to tear down some of the myths that have grown up about the Senate over these 200 years, because it is an institution that likes to wrap itself in these myths. These myths are self-serving, and they allow it to escape many of these hard questions. And so it was that effort to try to dig down, try to cut through a lot of these myths that you're told while you're there, while you're observing it from the outside, and get some answers that led me to write this book.
And then can you just explain, one thing I've learned over the years studying Congress is how important the rules are. And for many people watching, it's a rule, it's a process. It just sounds like some technical part of what the real action is, but it becomes clear that rules are the action. And I remember studying the civil rights movement. One of the great discoveries was they placed reforming the filibuster, reforming the committee system as a priority. And they literally ranked it with, ending segregation and ending lynching, criminalizing lynching. Can you just explain to everyone, before we jump into the filibuster, how rules work in the Senate, and why rules are so important if you really want to understand what's going on and how it works in the chamber?
That's right. Well, the Senate was designed, I think in many ways, the rules are more important in the Senate than any other body, and perhaps more important than the House, because the Senate was designed to be a leaderless institution where every individual senator can sort of avail themselves of the rules and use innovations to advance their goals. In the House, it's a very top-down place and has been for a long time. And so the only person who really needs to worry about the rules is the Speaker, because they make the rules and they control the Rules Committee. In the Senate, so just to unpack that for 1 second. So in the House, the Rules Committee is a majority rule committee. It is controlled by the Speaker, and that committee determines the rules for every single bill that comes to the floor, down to how much debate time there will be, how many amendments will be allowed, and all that stuff. The Rules Committee generates a rule that restricts everything about that bill. In the Senate, there is a Rules Committee, but it's very different. It only sort of deals with administrative issues and sort of housekeeping matters. It doesn't control the floor. The majority leader's power has sort of grown organically over time. Unlike in the House, the majority leader was not a position created by the Constitution. In fact, the original Senate did not have the positions of party leaders. They were not even invented as actual positions until the 1920s. And then even then, they didn't have much power. It wasn't until LBJ assumed the minority leader role, then majority leader, that he started to endow this role with much power. I describe in the book how often, so LBJ had a hard time deciding to take the job because the leaders more often found themselves humiliated and embarrassed than they had any real power. So, the Senate, every single thing that it does on any given day revolves around its rules. A senator who learns the rules can become very powerful very quickly. Senator James Allen of Alabama, who was sort of a mentor to Jesse Helms later, as I describe in the book, figured out how to use the rules very effectively. He had no real power. He wasn't senior on any committees. He wasn't in leadership. But because he learned the rules better than most of his contemporaries, he was able to make himself very powerful. So, and then Jesse Helms after him became even more powerful. So if you learn the rules, you can become very powerful. And this institution lives and dies by those rules. And you can sort of try to break down at least some of the top-down nature of those institutions.
I'm really struck by the fact that our democracy has these arcana that make it really important to understand those things. I mean, gerrymandering is another example where it sounds like an obscure topic, but it becomes the most important topic. So if we were to ask the founders, so what do you think of the filibuster? That's a weird word. Like, why did you think of that? What would the founders say about the filibuster?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the first thing they'd say is, what is a filibuster? Because it was not something that existed in their time.
Maybe we can tell everybody else, because I think this is this complicated thing going on here where we're going to do a deep dive into like Rule 22, and it's going to become a filibuster. And there's all this like weird shorthand. And the big thing is, it's just a big old wad that's clogging the pipes to keep things from happening, and it's a wad that the founders just didn't even know about.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's a baseline thing to set here, which is that we identify the filibuster as sort of the principal characteristic of the Senate, but it wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. And the evidentiary record is very clear on this. That first of all, they would have said, what is this thing? I have no idea what you're talking about. This word is alien to us, because the word didn't even come into existence until closer to the 1850s and 1860s. But then when you described it to them, they would have then said, okay, we are opposed to that, and we don't want to have any part of that. And that's a little bit speculation, but I think that the record is pretty open and shut on this. The reason we can say that with confidence is that the framers were very conscious of the threat of obstruction when they were designing the Senate and designing the Constitution, and they were very explicit about the ways that they sought to prevent that kind of obstruction. So even though they didn't know what the filibuster was, they knew that people might try to do things like it, and they made clear that they didn't want that to happen. The principal reason for this was that they were writing the Constitution in the shadows of the Articles of Confederation, which in their view and in the view of history had been a total disaster. And one of the main reasons it had been a disaster is that its Congress required a supermajority threshold for most
two-thirds vote,
a two-thirds threshold for most major pieces of legislation. And that didn't work. And so the framers were very clear as they were designing Congress that the supermajority threshold should be reserved for extraordinary measures, a very small handful of them, like amendments to the Constitution, removal from office after impeachment, and treaties. And everything else should be majority rule. And they were clear about this. They also were familiar with all of the conventional arguments for why you should have a supermajority threshold, such as the idea that it promotes bipartisanship and thoughtfulness. And they took on those arguments directly and rebutted them. In Federalist 22, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but in Federalist 22, Alexander Hamilton said, speaking of a supermajority threshold, he said, what at first sight might seem a remedy is in fact a poison. He went on to say that, you might think that the supermajority threshold would promote bipartisanship and cooperation, but in reality, what it does is it provides the party out of power with an irresistible temptation to throw a wrench into the gears and block what the majority is trying to do in order to make the majority look bad. I mean, these political incentives, in many ways, politics at its essence hasn't changed that much in 200 years. They knew that the minority might try to obstruct the majority and to make the majority look bad so the minority could get back into power. So they took on all these arguments directly. They also implemented clear rules and norms in the Senate specifically to guard against obstruction. There was a whole elaborate set of norms that were designed to limit debate. In Jefferson's Manual of Congressional Procedure that he wrote when he was the vice president and therefore the president of the Senate, he was very clear. There's a whole section called Order and Debate. And in that section, he's very clear that you should speak as much as you want to, but once you start to get obstructive and your colleagues decide they've heard enough, your colleagues had many ways to shut you up. One of those was to start talking over you, sort of like the music coming up at an Oscar speech. They would open the doors of the chamber to sort of signal that their time was up. And then there was an actual rule on the books called the previous question motion that allowed a majority of the Senate to vote to end debate if all of those other measures failed. That rule was done away with in a sort of 1806 rewrite because it was never used. Obstruction wasn't a big problem. But doing away with that rule is what opened up the loophole to obstructionists like John C. Calhoun, who came along later in the 19th century and started to innovate what we would now call the filibuster. But I'll stop there on this answer. I know we want to talk about Calhoun and minority obstruction more, but I just want to set that baseline expectation that the filibuster did not exist, and the overwhelming share of the evidence shows that the framers would have opposed it and did everything they could to try to prevent anything like it from coming into existence.
And they all felt this way. So for instance, like, if I understand your book correctly, it's a common conservative argument to say that Madison thought that the rights of the minority should be protected in the Senate. And you're saying that's not true at all, like that the Republican principle, that's the word they use, the Republican principle. Yeah, the Republican principle here on page 22. See, I read the book.
Yes.
Not just page 22.
That's right.
Wow,
Yeah.
22 is everywhere. Page 22, Federalist 22.
Yeah.
But anyway,
that's right.
he wanted majority rule. And so really, you're saying that like, how, so what was the mechanism for building consensus or compromise, if not this crazy rule of requiring 3/5 of the votes or what have you?
Well, so Madison was he's trying to pull off a tricky thing. And I think in many ways what happened was, the balance that he was trying to strike was maybe perhaps too delicate. He did believe in protecting minority rights, but as he made very clear, in particular in Federalist 10, which is often cited by conservatives in defense of Madison because they cherry pick a few quotes out of there, they cherry pick the part where he defends minority rights before he goes on to explain that the majority should rule when push comes to shove in the same paper. He wanted the Senate to be a place where the minority would always be able to have influence in the process and to have a say and to not be run roughshod over like they could in the House.
So they get a say, but the majority votes.
Right. They had
and the way that you build consensus or put a break on the process is all these other, our system is just filled with breaks.
Right.
Like you got the House, you got the Senate, you've got the president, you've got the federal courts. It seems like there are all these ways in which the whole thing can come to a halt.
That's
and
right.
What you're saying is that the Senate itself was not intended to be all by itself a place to stop things.
That's exactly right. It's the question of a voice versus a veto. And Madison wanted the minority to have a voice. He wanted them to always be able to stand up and hold the floor and say, here's what we think about this policy. Here's why we think the majority is wrong, and have a chance to persuade people to come over to their side, and maybe they would become the majority over the course of the debate. But he was very clear that, there should be reasonable limits on the amount of time that people were allowed to hold the floor and make these arguments. And that once they had their say, if they'd failed to win the debate and the majority still wanted to move, the majority should be allowed to move. He was explicit about this. He called majority rule, as you said, the Republican principle, small r Republican. What happened was, John Calhoun principally, and many conservatives for generations after him, took this idea of a minority voice and inflated it into the idea of a minority veto. Calhoun specifically was very explicit that that was his intent. In his disquisition on government that was published after his death, he explained that he was seeking to give he explained that he thought that Madison's protections for the minority were insufficient. He thought there should be more aggressive protections for the minority than Madison's system provided. And he explained that he was seeking to allow one portion of the community to exercise what he called a negative, in other words, a veto, over all the other portions of the community. So, I think, Sam, to your question, what we've seen over generations is conservatives take a kernel of truth about the idea that Madison did intend for the minority's role in the process to be protected, and inflate that into the idea that the minority deserves the right to exercise a veto if it so chooses over anything the majority wants to do. And that is far beyond what Madison ever intended.
So I want to kind of move us so we can move to the contemporary Senate. But so the filibuster is not part of the founding, and I think you definitely show that is not true. It's a practice that gains more popularity in the upper chamber. The idea of filibuster is one senator just speaking indefinitely and preventing the Senate from voting on a bill. And so that's what the filibuster ultimately is as it unfolded. So senators start to pick up this practice in the 19th century.
Right.
And then when does a rule come that some senators are able to stop this?
Yeah, so that rule comes in 1917, but it doesn't come in that form or guise, or definitely not with that intent. So 1917, what's happening is there's actually a group of progressive senators led by Robert Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, who are filibustering a bill that Wilson has put on the floor to arm American merchant ships. Wilson's allies have put on the floor to arm American merchant ships, as sort of a backdoor entry into World War I. And so La Follette's point, which was a legitimate one, was that this bill, is an entry into World War I. And if Wilson wants to enter World War I, he should make a declaration of war. And so on that basis, he was mounting a filibuster. And it was a 3-day filibuster that pushed the Senate past its deadline for adjournment, which scuttled the bill and created this massive public uproar because public opinion was strongly in favor of at least arming the ships and then soon entry into the war. So the Senate finds itself on the receiving end of this massive public backlash. Literally, senators are being burned in effigy across the country. This is when Wilson issues his famous statement calling the Senate a little band of willful men. And so senators are just getting creamed in the public opinion debate. The Senate reconvenes a few days later and convenes a committee that says, okay, enough is enough. We have to have a way to cut off these filibusters. In this case, there appeared to be upwards of 70 senators in favor of ending this filibuster and voting for Wilson's bill. So they said, all right, we got to find a way in a situation like this where there's clearly a large majority in favor of at least ending debate and moving to vote, to give ourselves the tool to do this. And what they did is they basically reinvented that rule that I mentioned that used to be in the Senate books and was done away with in 1806. That was called the previous motion rule. This new rule was called Cloture. I think the T in that word trips a lot of people up. It's really closure, and was often described as closure for many, many years in New York Times and other usages. So they invent this rule called Cloture, that effectively gives senators the ability to vote to end debate. and is explicitly designed to be a tool to end filibusters. The committee that created it called it a tool to terminate successful filibustering, in their own words. But the one thing that they did that made it different from the previous rule was that they set the threshold to end debate higher than the threshold to pass a bill. So the threshold to pass a bill in the Senate was and is today still a majority. They set the threshold to cut off debate at a supermajority. At the time, it was 2/3. Since then, it's been lowered to 3/5. And that is why you have this 60-vote threshold that everything gets hung up on in the Senate today. So just to be absolutely clear about this was never intended to be like a substitute decisive vote on a bill. This was supposed to be a tool that senators could reach for if a debate was going on for too long and they wanted to end a filibuster. But what happened was that Southern senators, white supremacists, self-avowed white supremacists of the South, started to see that what this rule did in reality could be repurposed to start applying a higher threshold to certain types of bills if they were very committed about how they applied this rule. And naturally, the one category of bills to which they wanted to apply this higher threshold to pass were civil rights bills. And this is an important point when, this myth of delay in the Senate and this myth of the Senate as a cooling saucer often is attached to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And there's sort of this pervasive idea that America wasn't ready for civil rights until we passed this bill, and that passing it earlier might have caused an uproar. And that just doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence. Starting in the 1920s, you had certain kinds of civil rights bills, primarily anti-lynching bills and anti-poll tax bills, start to pass the House by broad majorities. They appeared to have strong majority support in the Senate, and they had presidents of both parties saying they were ready to sign them. So the Southerners in the Senate needed a way to stop the march of progress that the majority was behind. The American public, just like with the background checks bill we started to talk about earlier, the American public was ready for action. When Gallup polled the issue of federal anti-lynching laws in 1937, it found 72% of Americans in support of these laws. When it polled anti-poll tax laws in the 1940s, it found upwards of 60% of Americans in favor of these laws. So America was ready to start passing civil rights bills in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Majorities in the House were ready to pass these bills, even majorities in the Senate. And what stopped them was the application of this new rule to provide a higher threshold and force these bills to clear not a majority that every other bill was passing or failing on, but to raise the threshold for civil rights bills only to a supermajority of 2/3 at the time. It took a lot of work to apply it, because back then you still had to do a talking filibuster and then make the majority cut you off by using this rule. But what's happened essentially, if you fast forward to today, is we've taken this higher standard that we used to apply only to civil rights bills and caused them to be delayed, caused their passage to be delayed for nearly a century. And now we're applying this to every issue. And so the same kind of gridlock, obviously a higher threshold makes it harder to pass things. And this gridlock that we saw on civil rights for a century is now happening on all other issues, despite the fact that they have everything you're supposed to have in our system to pass: broad public support, majority support in the House and Senate, and presidents willing to sign them. So that's how we got from the talking filibuster of the Jimmy Stewart era. And that movie, of course, was in the 1930s. And so that was as the filibuster was starting to evolve into this new thing. But it's that Jim Crow era where they innovated this idea of applying a higher threshold. And fast forward through a bunch of procedural changes that were really boring, it's became easier to apply. And that is now why that higher threshold is applied to all bills today.
Well, let's talk about that. So, and that's why President Obama has called the filibuster a Jim Crow relic. I think you just provided the context. This was really associated with blocking progress on civil rights legislation, not a cooling mechanism, but an obstruction mechanism. And the story you tell, though, is you get from that, and you get from the drama of 1964, when television is covering the filibuster, and all of a sudden people know what this thing is, as opposed to people just inside the chamber. But after the 70s, there's rules changes. They changed the number to 60 in terms of the number of senators needed to end a filibuster, from 67 to 60. They create a 2-track system, so you don't actually have to filibuster. You just say you're going to filibuster. But what you document is, since that time, this thing has just become a normal tool. And you start to see that all legislation, requires 60 votes. That's the threshold, the pivot point, as one political scientist talks about. How did this happen? Was this both parties did this? Was it any particular issue? How do we go from 1964 to today, when basically, if you're in the Senate, as you were, you need to find 60 votes on anything other than this budget reconciliation process, which we can put aside?
Right, budget, yes. You know, it's a complicated answer, and I think the most important point to drive home is that there was never an affirmative decision to make 60 votes the norm. That's another thing that you hear all the time, is that this new norm that we've sort of come to accept reflects the sort of collective wisdom of the Senate, and that, you know, maybe it wasn't that way in the past, but there's sort of been a decision to make it that way now, and there just wasn't. They basically backed into it through a series of sort of, you know, tangentially related rules changes, combined with the overwhelmingly rapidly growing workload of the Senate and the need to sort of streamline the process of managing the floor, plus the fact that the filibuster is sort of an irresistible tool for any individual senator who sees it as something that they can use to advance their sort of pet projects. What you had after 1964 was, you know, the filibuster became disassociated with civil rights. And to the surprise of many people, it started to become used on other issues. While, you know, many senators were opposed to civil rights, they couldn't help but see how effective the filibuster had been at blocking civil rights. And so they thought to themselves, well, gee, you know, I could use that to block some issue I'm opposed to and extract you know, some sort of concession on this bill or that bill. It will make me as an individual senator very powerful. So you had this, and then on top of all that, you had a sort of cultural backlash in the Senate to the sort of iron-fisted top-down rule that LBJ had imposed, first as majority leader and then sort of from the White House as president. And his successor, Mike Mansfield, took a totally different approach. They political scientists have described this as the era of the individualistic Senate. It was a sort of, you know, in tune with the era. It was, you know, anything goes. Mansfield was not trying to give top-down direction. He wanted to encourage senators to experiment with new procedural innovations. And so all of this kind of combined to start to have this tool be used more frequently. And like you alluded to before, you know, the workload of the majority leader was becoming so overwhelming that they had an interest in finding out ahead of time if a senator was planning to filibuster. And so they started canvassing the caucus ahead of time and saying, hey guys, if anybody's planning to filibuster, let me know. And all you had to do was notify the leader of your intent, and that might make the leader choose not to bring the bill to the floor, or at least know that they had a filibuster coming.
And so all this turns into like a little shorthand where you don't have to talk, you don't have to invoke the rule, you don't have to actually vote. You just kind of go like, woo, and then and then people are like, oh, he just went like, woo, and then like, oh, I guess we better not do that. So the whole thing like got condensed into this shorthand.
Right.
One thing in your book that really struck me is you write about something that I've read about in Robert Caro's book when Lyndon Johnson was Senate leader. The idea that the Senate cloakroom was an exciting place to be. Like there's Johnson on the phone on one hand, phone on the other hand, like real like kind of 1940s executive kind of stuff, like, or whoever it is, who you know, doing these things, wielding power.
Right.
And now you say that it's kind of this sad place with like, you know, like worn out styrofoam cups or what have you. So it strikes me, I want to fast forward even a little bit more and talk about people who innovated using the rules, either to get things moving or to stop things moving. And it strikes me that there are some heroes of this, or anti-heroes, depending on your point of view. So like the 60 vote thing, this has become common wisdom. Like is either Reid or McConnell at the heart of this? Are these people the innovators who have said, this is a good tool? Because it strikes me that the use of the filibuster just skyrocketed during the Obama administration.
Right.
And, you know,
well, I mean, definitely both parties had a role in making the filibuster and the 60 vote threshold an accepted norm. I mean, essentially, whichever party was in the minority at the time found it, you know, at some point in their interest to argue that this 60 vote threshold should be the new norm, and they would, you know, pull out whatever examples they could find of saying, well, this has always been done, and so, you know, we should be able to do it on this issue. The Judicial Wars were one place where this really started to come into play a lot. And Republicans would say that Democrats were the first to start deploying the 60 vote threshold against judicial nominees, and there's certainly some validity to that, and filibustering some of Bush's nominees, the second George Bush nominees like Miguel Estrada, who some have argued should not have been filibustered. My own Senator Reid was there; he filibustered him. He since said he regretted that. So I think there's some validity to the argument that was an inappropriate deployment of the 60 vote threshold. But basically, every time, it was still unusual to deploy it, but whoever was deploying it would then argue that it was totally normal. And so,
right. So basically, little teeny tiny steps.
Yeah, exactly. And so then the next time, Republicans were out of power, they could point to the time that Democrats had argued that this was normal to justify their normalization. But, this was happening in drips and drabs, and it accelerated massively under Senator McConnell. If you look at the chart on sort of the rise of the use of this, it's basically a flat line at 0 through the first 2/3 of the century, and then starts ticking up in the 70s. But then sort of enters a range of maybe 30 or 40 times per 2-year session of the Senate. But then when McConnell comes into power, it skyrockets. It literally doubles year to year from his ascension to minority leader in 2007, and then continues to go up from there. So what he discovered was what he did was something fundamentally different in degree. He realized that this tool could be used as a weapon of mass obstruction, and that if you deployed it against everything, you created something that was greater than the sum of its parts, because you created an overall environment that was sludgy, that caused everything to move at a glacial pace, and that the net effect of that would cause the party in power to lose political altitude. The public would see gridlock, the public would see things moving, everything that happened would be as painful as politically possible, and that there was a sort of larger net effect to the party and the minority of deploying it in this mass way. And that was a risk at the time. In 2009, a lot of political commentators were saying there's enormous political risk for Republicans if they obstruct this popular president. And one of McConnell's key strategic insights was that it would be hard for Democrats to pin blame on Republicans for the massive use of this tactic, because people don't want to hear excuses, and that ended up proving to be an accurate insight.
Let me take this conversation in a place where neither of you is intending for it to go, and that's in the direction of math. So you got this 2/3 rule, 67 votes, or whatever number, 60, whatever votes it was back then.
Right.
Then it gets turned to a 60 vote threshold. In the meantime, the Senate was not a closely divided body at that time. Like Franklin Roosevelt at one point had 76 senators of his party. President Johnson had supermajorities during his time in office. And so we had a high threshold for ending debate, achieving closure, that didn't seem that high at the time because there are these big majorities. And a hallmark of our modern age of politics since the mid-90s has been a closely divided Senate, where it's mostly between, say 45 and 55 seats. Like that one magical moment in 2009, there were 60 seats for the Democrats. The most seats the Republicans ever had was 55. And so as the chamber becomes more closely divided, this 60 vote threshold becomes important. And it seems to me that this is just a numbers game, where as the number of seats controlled by one party goes down like this threshold suddenly becomes important. And so now we're in this thing called, I was thinking it was the zone of legislative death. What kind of national vote does it take to get to 60 votes? And I was doing some numbers. Roughly speaking, it looks to me like there's a zone of legislative death where if the last 3 Senate elections, right, because that's how long it takes the whole Senate to turn over, if the national vote is between 49% for Democrats and 56% for Democrats, more or less, that zone is this zone of death where nobody has 60 seats. Mm-hmm. And if you're in that 49 to 56% zone, forget it. And if the Republicans can get the Democrats below 49%, or rather Republicans get above 51, they get 60 seats. If Democrats can get all the way up to 56%, then they get 60 seats. And so basically, because we're in an age of close politics, this zone of death is just normal life, and it seems like it's going to be normal life until we get out of this closely divided age we're in. So okay, so I've got one for you. You're a Democrat.
Yeah.
I just described a zone that actually is favorable for Republicans. 49% is pretty close to 50. So the Republicans don't have to win such a huge vote to get a supermajority. Democrats have to get all the way to 56%.
Right.
So you, spoiler alert, want to get rid of the filibuster. It's in the last chapter. Okay, it's in the last chapter of the book.
Yeah.
Would you be okay with that? Like getting rid of the filibuster, and the price is there's a structural advantage for Republicans of a few percentage points. What we get is we get to actually vote on things.
Right. I am in favor of it because I think that there's a structural advantage for progressives in making it easier to pass things, because I think that the conservative side of the ideological spectrum wants to stop things. I mean,
I see. They just don't want laws passed. Their
exactly.
idea of a good time is no laws.
Right. You know, William F. Buckley standing athwart history yelling stop. I mean, you know, and so the progressive side achieves its agenda by making change. And the only real way to make lasting change in American politics is to pass legislation, executive actions, all that other stuff, even judicial decisions. Often, you know, look at Brown v. Board of Education, and didn't have much impact until they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You need legislation to make long and lasting change. And as long as it is virtually impossible, as you are describing, for progressives to pass legislation, they are operating at a massive disadvantage. So even though the Senate itself might make it easier for Republicans to attain the majority, I think that Democrats have to re-empower themselves to be able to pass the legislation that they want to pass. I would also argue that I think that, you know, Republicans can get rid of this just as easily as we can. And I think under the Trump era, the Republican Senate found itself in a position where the filibuster served a useful purpose for them because it shielded them from having to pass all the crazy stuff that Trump wanted them to pass. They got their tax cut bill through reconciliation, which, you know, is an end run around the filibuster. They got all of their judges without the filibuster. And so they were happy. And it was useful for them to be able to point to the 60 vote threshold when Trump was calling on them to do something crazy and say, whoops, sorry. But the next time you have a Republican president and a Republican Senate working in tandem to pass things, they're just going to get rid of the filibuster themselves.
No, they wouldn't do that. What are you saying?
Yeah,
That's
right.
Crazy
Exactly.
talk. That is no.
Right.
No,
if you're counting on forbearance from Mitch McConnell to not get rid of the filibuster when he's in power,
straight.
I think you
I mean, basically, like I was saying before, it's a race to 50, where like supermajorities in the Senate, 60 vote threshold. Yeah. Now we're in this zone of death.
Right.
So are you saying that, for example, let's say we get a 50 vote threshold, like by some miracle, the senators from West Virginia and Arizona think, oh yeah, it would be nice to pass some laws. We get, let's say, a new Voting Rights Act. We get the For the People Act, HR 1. We get a minimum wage increase, like all these things that we as a nation, that most people in the United States seem to want. And the price is, okay, maybe in the future when President Hawley and a Republican Senate decide that they want to like get rid of the Affordable Care Act. What you're saying is, you know what, we're here to make laws, and if they get in control of that, then they should do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially right. But I would also say that you know, the structural disadvantage that you're talking about can't be fixed until we get rid of the filibuster. There's a self-protecting aspect to this too, where if you get rid of the filibuster and you pass some of the laws you mentioned, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or things like statehood for DC and Puerto Rico, then you are starting to tilt that structural advantage back towards Democrats. You're never going to get it all the way there, but you can create a much more level playing field. So I think if you were to pass a new, you know, invigorated VRA, and take away, you know, Republicans are basically staked to this massive electoral welfare in every election that they run in right now. If you take that away, you make it harder for them to take back the Senate. If you give statehood to DC and Puerto Rico, you are making the Senate, in all likelihood, tilted back towards a more level playing field. So it's not just that I think we should get rid of it and sort of let the chips fall where they may. It's that in order to address some of these structural disadvantages from Democrats themselves, we have to get rid of the filibuster, because none of the things that address those structural disadvantages are going to be able to be passed as long as the filibuster remains in place.
So you got to clog the big pipe before you can fix the toilets.
Yeah, and then throw on top of all those arguments the fact that the next time it is to Mitch McConnell's advantage, next time he has means, motive, and opportunity to get rid of the filibuster, he's just going to do it himself. And I think, you know, there's obviously a risk here, but I think that those three factors, to me, make an argument that the risk is worth it for us to get rid of it and try to, you know, attack some of these structural disadvantages while we have some power.
What year were you working for Senator Reid?
I started in 2010 through when he retired in 2017.
So you were there in 2013 when you were there when he was a leader who moved forward with changing the filibuster rules with what was called the nuclear option, and he changes it for federal appointments, court appointments. Can you just, since you know that well, kind of what was his decision-making process like? Because he went through what the debate is and he said, okay, let's do it. It was a big deal. It created a precedent for McConnell to do the same. Not that he needs a precedent, but he did it then with the Supreme Court. But maybe talk about him as an example of a Democrat who finally said, kind of, let's pull the kill switch, at least in this era.
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that, because I think, people look back in retrospect and they think of Reed as sort of a crusading reformer of the Senate, and he wasn't. It took him a long time to get to the decision that reform was necessary. And so, when I see Senator Manchin and Sinema making these statements, I think back to the many statements that Senator Reed made saying he would never reform the rules or get rid of the filibuster before he then proceeded to do exactly that. I think being on both sides of this issue is sort of a rite of passage in many ways, or at least, starting somewhere and finding a way to get to yes. But yeah, I mean, I think that what it was something that I think will be a similar dynamic now, which is basically circumstances converging to force you to the conclusion that you have no other options. And so this was 2013. This was 5 years into the Obama administration and after the reelection of President Obama. And I think that's a crucial point, because when Obama was reelected, for a little while, there was sort of a widespread belief that the fever would break, as Obama himself described it, that the Tea Party was going to be a passing, craze. Republicans would go back to being normal. They released their autopsy after Romney was defeated, saying we have to stop being crazy and we have to find a way to, broaden our appeal. And, over the course of the year 2013, it became clear that that was not happening, that if anything, they were going even further in the Tea Party direction. And so we couldn't expect cooperation from them on the president's nominees. That's compounded by the fact that at the time, Obama was on track to have the fewest judicial appointments confirmed of any president since Ronald Reagan. And Reed understood the importance of the judiciary, in addition to his cabinet nominees who were being blocked. And he concluded that, 2014 was coming up. We were at risk of losing the majority. This might be his last opportunity to confirm all of this backlog of nominees that were being held up by Republican obstruction. And that essentially, he tried everything else. For 5 years, he tried these things that we call gentlemen's agreements, where they sort of agree to be on good behavior and not obstruct so much and all this. Nothing worked. If we were going to confirm these nominees, he needed to pull the trigger and go nuclear. And so he did. And because he did, we were able to clear this massive backlog of Obama nominees. We were able to confirm many Obama judicial nominees who would not have been confirmed otherwise. So today on the federal bench, there are many Obama nominees serving lifetime appointments who would not have been confirmed if Reed had not gone nuclear. And those are vacancies that McConnell and Trump would have filled. Some people throw it back in your face and say, okay, well, you made it easier for McConnell to go nuclear and confirm his judges into that. I say, listen, if you think that McConnell would have sat there and let Democrats filibuster his precious judicial nominees, I think you are probably making a miscalculation. Obama, if the filibuster had still been in place when Trump came to power, I think McConnell would have found the first opportunity, the first time Democrats filibustered any of Trump's nominees, he would have found a way to go nuclear himself. And so not only would he have gotten all of the judicial nominees that he got anyway, he would have had more vacancies to fill, because we would have, by leaving the filibuster in place, we would have confirmed far fewer Obama nominees. So, I think essentially that was Reed's thinking. He was pushed to the brink. He realized he had no other option. And essentially, that is what I think is likely to happen now, is that Republican obstruction is going to force Democrats' hand, even for senators like Manchin and Sinema, to say, look, we tried our best, but we really have no other option. And now the choice is either reform or essentially giving up on these important agenda items.
I think Dorothea is here to ask some questions from the chat, but maybe you can work them into your other answers. Mm-hmm. Could you name, just briefly, for people listening, other than getting rid of the filibuster, what are some concrete reforms that would make the Senate a more functional institution right now in 2021?
Absolutely, yeah. And then I lay a lot of this out in the book. I mean, I think one of the things that we can do in the Senate is to restore debate. I think that debate serves many purposes. It's not just for senators grandstanding. I think there's actually a productive, healthy quality to it. It forces senators to listen to each other. And it reminds people that the Senate was supposed to actually be a platform for persuasion and for trying to make your case to the public. So I think restoring sort of a use it or lose it quality to debate, where if you want to hold up a bill, go right ahead, but you got to go to the floor to do it. You've got to make a speech. You got to explain to people why you're holding it up. If you think of the background checks example, someone, if they were going to block this background checks bill, they should have had to go to the floor and explain to the 90% of American people who supported this bill why they opposed it. And if you have the guts to do that, more power to you. Make your case. But if you don't want to do that, you shouldn't then be allowed to block it from the privacy of your office. So, restoring that use it or lose it quality to debate would be one concrete reform. Separate from the filibuster, because I feel like we're going to come back to that, I'm sure, in the questions too. I think the Senate has acquired this top-down quality to it, where, senators basically have almost a learned helplessness where they are given their schedule every day. The leadership establishes, the ins and outs of everything that happens on the floor minute to minute. I think deconstructing those partisan leadership structures and restoring some of the individuality and power to individual senators would be a very important change for the Senate, and be a healthy thing for the institution going forward.
So thank you for this conversation. It's really fascinating. The book is called Kill Switch, and Sam has described for us this zone of death. So the stakes are very high in all of this, and that is so palpable in your book. For me, some of that actually hinges on this, what you describe as this loss of the culture of debate. That, to me, is where a lot of the emotional drama in reading your book is, that you sort of watch that happen on the page, and you really wonder what politics can be without a culture of debate. But we have some questions in the queue, and I will just pull from here and start with a pretty simple sounding one that has to do with this question of debate on the Senate floor, which is, would simply requiring a talking filibuster, so going back to the necessity of it being a talking filibuster, solve the problem?
I think it would solve a lot of the problem. I mean, I don't want to underestimate the ability of obstructionists to, further innovate. But what you basically saw during the period where the talking filibuster was the norm in the Senate was that, it was hard to use. So people didn't use it that often. They used it when they really cared about something, and that's fine. And people should be allowed to do that. But, generally, bills passed or failed on whether they could muster a majority. And I think, I go back to the Jim Crow era, because this was the sort of a brief period where you had a contrast that you could look at, and you had, civil rights being forced to clear a supermajority threshold. And then you had every other category of legislation pass or fail based on whether it could muster a majority. And so this is the period, of course, when we, basically built the post-war America. And, the government did a reasonably good job of being responsive on basically every other issue except civil rights. On civil rights, it suffered an 87-year delay between the end of Reconstruction in 1964 on addressing an urgent issue that was literally a matter of life and death. And so this is where you can sort of see the contrast. The talking filibuster, without that 60-vote threshold, was applied to other issues. And on all these other issues, what would happen was you'd either force a compromise and that issue would move along, or there would be no compromise and the majority would just proceed. So, there weren't that many instances of this happening. There's only a handful, but no other bill was stopped by the filibuster. If it was applied, it maybe served some productive purpose, maybe delayed things a little bit, but the bill went ahead and was passed. And so I think that contrast is very instructive. I think if you forced people to use a talking filibuster, that is what you would see more often, where people would make their case, they would delay it. They wouldn't use it that often because it's a pain in the butt to use, but things would generally pass or fail on a majority. I think it does have to be backed up by the threat of majority cloture. In other words, the majority has to be able to call an end to this debate after a reasonable amount of time. So I think there, should be some reasonable person limits to say, I don't know, weeks or maybe a month. I don't know, if you want to get crazy and say, if you want to talk for a month, talk for a month. That's probably too much. But, after that time, when you get to that point in the argument where you're just repeating yourself and you haven't convinced anybody and we're just sort of, staring at each other, let's end that debate and wrap it up. But generally, I do think restoring a talking filibuster would be a productive reform.
Yeah, especially if you say, don't repeat yourself. That seems like a really tricky.
Well, the Senate has it. I mean, but the Senate originally had a 2-hour and two debate rule where any individual senator was not allowed to debate a topic more than twice. So, this idea of limits was baked into the Senate, and people knew that senators would have a tendency to do this. And they said, okay, guys, listen, if you can't make your point, in two separate speeches that are 2 hours each, then, probably you should just move on.
Yeah. So there's more interest in the queue, not surprisingly, about what can be done. And a question comes from Bill Atkins. Have we already missed the window for filibuster reform, or could it still happen before the 2020 midterm?
So there's different ways to do it. And what Bill's probably thinking of is there's in the past, people have argued that you had to do it at the beginning of the session. But since then, it's become very much accepted practice and established precedent that you can do it at any time. So the answer is no, we have not missed our window. They can do it literally at any time. The way you do reform now in this case, and this is sort of response to changes that were made by Richard Russell that I get into in the book, where he tried to make reform, put it in a lockbox and make it impossible to do. But the way you do it now is you essentially you vote to overturn a ruling of the chair. And the Senate is designed to respect the will of a majority of its body. That is sort of the superseding principle that overrides everything else. So basically, at any given point, you ask the chair, the presiding officer, to say, tell me how many votes it takes to end this filibuster. And the presiding officer would tell you that it takes 60 votes because that's what the rules say. And then you simply have a majority of senators vote to say, not anymore. Now it takes a majority. And that is that precedent then overrides the existing.
And that could happen anytime.
It could happen anytime.
Like tomorrow it can happen.
Literally tomorrow. Yeah. And all you need, look, I say this in the book, like it's a pretty depressing history of this institution, but there's one really good piece of good news, which is that it only takes a majority of senators to change the rules in any way they want to. But all of these, restrictions on the filibuster could be changed, eliminated. It could be done incrementally. It could be done all at once. But it only takes 50 senators because the sort of dominant principle in the Senate is that it is designed to recognize the will of itself, the will of the chamber, and that will is represented by a majority of the body, which just also reaffirms the principle that it was always supposed to be a majority rule body.
Can't we have don't West Virginia and Arizona really need some nice bridges?
Yeah,
infrastructure. It seems like Arizona could use some really awesome infrastructure, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that is essentially, when I see what Manchin and Sinema are doing, I see a very smart leverage play. They're going to get a lot for their votes if and when they eventually move. I also think there's plenty of room for them to move into issues of filibuster reform or restoration of Senate tradition and the talking filibuster and all these things. I think that's the direction they go in.
And they could save face that way by saying, no, we didn't. We just restored it to what it was, which was an opportunity for debate. Because just today, Sinema was just saying that it's an opportunity for debate and discussion. And all right, well, you know what, Senator, if that's what you want, then let's go there.
Right.
And it just seems like there are ways in which they could say that they stayed true to their principles, and yet,
But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the fact that Democrats have a strong incentive to deliver results. And so one thing, an example is that Senator Sinema's fellow Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona is up for re-election again because his was a special election, so he's up in 2022 again. Mark Kelly is going to need to deliver results to win re-election.
Well, Warnock is up,
and Warnock is up.
I mean, there's some serious jeopardy there, and the House is going to flip. There's a good chance the House is going to flip Republican on redistricting alone.
And so A, we might lose the majority, and this is our last chance to do stuff. And B, the only way we're going to retain the majority is we have a strong hand to show voters and say, look at all the stuff we did that changed your lives for the better. And so at the end of the day, peer pressure is a powerful force. And, Sinema's colleagues coming to her, Manchin's colleagues coming to him and saying, look, guys, we've tried everything. Are you going to leave me out to dry here because of your weird love for the filibuster? I think, eventually that's going to overwhelm. The other thing that's been really interesting, sorry to go off on this, is that I think there was an expectation in the stances, when they took the stances they did, that there would be a cheering section and that there would be this vocal support for them, and they were maintaining Senate tradition, all this stuff. But one of the things that's been fascinating to me is in the last few weeks is you've seen that cheering section doesn't exist. And you've had even conservative commentators like David Frum, David Brooks come out and say, basically probably said Democrats should go ahead and do this. And so, Manchin and Sinema are really out on a limb in a way I think they probably didn't expect, where there's basically nobody supporting their position and everybody else saying, it's time to do some stuff and we should do it.
Crickets. They're just hearing crickets.
Right.
Yeah, I think, Adam, the longer you talk, the more of the questions in the queue you're already answering, which is great. There's one that was precisely about Cinema Mansion and what it would take to make the case for Democrats, and whether it's just an historical argument. And I think you've just said it's a historical and strategic argument. So you have answered that. Let's see. You've also answered, are both parties equally responsible for elevating the filibuster to a mainstream decision-making process, meaning you've answered it yes and no. Unless there's something else you want to add to that on that topic.
No, I think that's it. I mean, they're both responsible, but McConnell, Reid and the other leaders of that era, Reid, Baker, Mitchell, sort of traded back and forth on a similar scale, and then McConnell just took it to a new level.
I mean, at some level, McConnell's a titanic figure in modern politics, despite being not a household name, right? Like, he has really elevated these ideas to sound like rules, where he says, well, don't want to confirm a Supreme Court justice in the last year of a presidency. I mean, back then anyway, but now it's different.
Right.
What I meant is when the president and the Senate are opposite parties. That's what I really meant.
Right.
And so it's sort of like this weird game of Calvin ball, where the House is a chamber where the majority makes the rules, and the Senate is at least under McConnell, is a chamber where McConnell made the rules.
Yeah, and I think it's actually instructive and sort of a teachable moment. And like the Biden rule that he invented to block Garland, which he took a random quote from 20 years ago, and all of a sudden, argued that this was precedent. But the only upside of this is that this is kind of how the Senate has always worked and how it has always made its rules. And we're told that is, this sort of generational wisdom that's being passed down. But, Richard Russell, who has a building named after him, who was a, massive self-avowed white supremacist, basically did the same thing in his era and made it up as he went along and wrapped himself in this institutional wisdom. John Calhoun, in his time, when he was sort of innovating the filibuster, did the exact same thing and said, I am now, carrying on James Madison's tradition. Madison, until he was alive at one point in the nullification crisis, said, no, you're not. I object. But then he died, and Calhoun went on to sort of wrap himself in that tradition. So in the way that McConnell just sort of makes stuff up and tries to, in his, sort of baritone, say this is a new Senate tradition, that's kind of how we got here, is that people have just been doing that for centuries, making stuff up as they go along to serve their narrow political interests, and then arguing that it is, they themselves are the human embodiment of this institutional.
In future years, we can archive it in the Mansion Cinema Senate office building.
Yeah, that's right. Whatever they want.
So we're sort of at the top of the hour. There's a few more questions in the queue. And there's a view onto all of this from a Canadian diplomat, and it is always, I think, a helpful reminder how all of this looks from the outside, which is a little bit nuts. But I think I want to give the last question to Matthew Huck, who is asking whether there's a U.S. senator that you wish more people knew about, either for good or bad, and who did you learn the most about in the writing of the book?
Well, the last part first, I would say Richard Russell is the person that I learned the most about, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I saw in the chat someone earlier was saying they're here from Roswell, Georgia. Maybe there are more Georgians on the call, but my mom is from just Atlanta, from Decatur, just outside of Atlanta. I've been to Stone Mountain, the Georgia tradition there was fascinating to me, and learning about him. And, there's an office building named after him that I was in many times, and you're taught that he is this, great institutionalist. And then you find out that he was actually a horrible self-avowed white supremacist. And I don't use that term lightly. He literally said, any Southern man worth a pinch of salt would give his all to maintain white supremacy. Those were his exact words. And he said many times that was the main purpose of his career. So I learned a lot more about him in the book. And then the senator, I would mention, the first person who comes to mind is Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. I think that she is an incredible senator, and who never gets enough credit. But she's an incredible leader and an incredibly thoughtful senator, and has, not coincidentally, because of my love for her, also supports the elimination of the filibuster. But she's someone who I think flies under the radar a little bit, but is a wonderful senator and does a great job for her state.
Well, this has been really fascinating. It's a good sign that we didn't get to all the questions. It means there's a lot more curiosity, and I encourage you all to take that curiosity to this great book and get your answers there. So I just can only end by thanking all of you. There are many of you, 350 something, for joining us tonight, and thanking the three of you for your time and for this thoughtful conversation. So I hope to see you all on future events, and wish you a good night. Take care, everybody.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.